Jonathan Maples, Elm Thicket, Northpark. My mother and father were married in the late 50s, early 60s, and they lived in the Oak Cliff area initially. However, we got to Elm Thicket, Northpark, probably about the time I was 2 or 3 years old. We lived on Hopkins. We actually lived at 4531 Hopkins. My grandmother already lived on that street. I also had an uncle that lived on that street, so that's where we were for a period of time. So I grew up on Hopkins and I grew up on March. So I lived at 4531 Hopkins, and then I lived at 4619 March. By that time, my grandma had already purchased a house on March. She lived at 4810, and then I had an uncle that lived at 4811 March, and I had an aunt who lived on Kenwell, the street that March dead ends into. So as you can see, I was surrounded by a lot of family right there. You know, back in those days, friends were family. You know, this neighborhood was a tremendous family unit. You always hear the old cliche that it takes a village. The time that I grew up in Elm Thicket, Northpark, from the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, it truly was a village. You can best believe that if you went somewhere and did something wrong, before you could get home, the news that you did wrong was already there. So when you get to have a group of people who care enough about each other to where they're looking after each other's child's best interest, then that's a strong neighborhood. And this neighborhood was a very strong neighborhood. My father was a supervisor over at Sky Chef. And Sky Chef was the local company that provided refreshments for flights out of Love Field. So that's what he did. My grandmother, she was more of a maid. She took on some of those jobs, and then she worked in some of the local schools up off of Marsh and Midway as well. We played all over the place, and we had a good time playing. And there was so much pride in the residents and the streets, different streets. We would actually come together and say, hey, Stiegel is playing Hopkins, or Hopkins is playing against March. So we would play, you know, direct our teams that way. So it was a good time. We played everywhere. This was Elm Thicket, Northpark. I mean, the Elm Thicket, Northpark, we got national championships winners here. We got Super Bowl winners here. We got the child of one of the young ladies who had that won the gold medal this past year. Grew up here. I mean, there are deep roots. We have city officials who grew up in Elm Thicket, Northpark. Plus, Elm Thicket, Northpark is, you know, it's 15 minutes from anywhere in Dallas. You know, the way Dallas has grown. And there's a very, very rich history here. You know, one of the things I could say that I can think back to, as long as a president has been visiting Dallas, they put they'd land Air Force One and leave it at Love Field Airport. So all we had to do was walk to the end of the street and we could see the presidential motorcade. Every neighborhood can't say that. I mean, it really can't. So it's a very special neighborhood, and I have a very special bond with this neighborhood. Well, the significant places are, you know, the school, KB Polk Recreation Center. Back when I was growing up at the corner of University and Roper, you know, that was the heart of the neighborhood. You know, you had your laundromat, you had barbershop, you had a restaurant, you had your convenience store. You know, those were, you know, staples of the neighborhood. But each street, in its own special way, is and will be a staple of this neighborhood, because a lot of special people lived on every single street. Important areas of the neighborhood today are all the churches, this recreation center, and KB Polk School. These are the important areas of this neighborhood. Now, to the east of this neighborhood, you have Inwood Village. And to the west, you have Love Field Airport. And north and south, you have anything and everything you could imagine, because we're just that close to everything here. But as it relates to this neighborhood, This spot we're sitting in right now in this KB Polk Recreation Center is pretty much the backbone. All right, so the Juneteenth, the Elm Thicket Northpark Juneteenth celebration is a grand occasion, and we look forward to it every year. I actually sit on the committee with several other committee members, and we look forward to doing this every year because if you know the history of Juneteenth, then you know how important it is to make sure that it's celebrated, because it's one of those situations to where if you forget your past, you're doomed to repeat it. And that past is something we're never going back to. So we celebrate the accomplishment of those who have come forward. And it's one of those teaching moments where we're teaching the children and letting them know what their history is. And the parade is just another grand part of that. And I believe that we're the only community in the city limits that has a parade. And I think the King Center is the only other center that possibly does a Juneteenth celebration on the scale that we do. Many, many years ago, before I was born, you know, this was a Caucasian neighborhood. Well, as time changed, they left the neighborhood and decided to go and live in the suburbs. Well, somewhere along the way, they started to try to figure out, oh, look what we left behind. Well, since that time, this neighborhood has been populated by, you know, mostly African American. And that is starting to change now, as you will see more of the Caucasians want to come back into this neighborhood. And it is a daily fight. And we're ready for the fight. However, this project is part of the reason why I wanted to make sure that we did it, so that I can remind everybody of the rich history that we have here, so that we can fight to hold on to it. There are a lot of houses that are coming up that are larger houses. Some people would call it McMansions. They dwarf some of the regular houses that have been here for years. So that's the biggest thing we're dealing with right now. Yeah, we have a lot of residents who have left the neighborhood. And you know, you can't be upset for people leaving the neighborhood, because people leave the neighborhood for better opportunities. Their jobs take them different places. But I honestly believe those who have left this neighborhood and gone to live everywhere else still have a footprint here. And I honestly believe that if called on, they will always come back to support this neighborhood and anything that's going on. Change is change. One thing about life is it's always going to change. It's either going to change for the positive or for the negative. This is America. You know, everyone has the right to live where they want to live. My mindset is, if you're going to live somewhere, adjust to where you're living. Don't come somewhere and try to take over. So that is the biggest change that we're seeing, is that it's okay to come to this neighborhood and live. It's not a problem. But when you come to this neighborhood and live, know that we live a certain way, just like all the other neighborhoods in the country, and welcome. Now, the development can be a problem, because with development, the people who generally come in don't necessarily see eye to eye with those who have already been here. And not all the time do they seek direction as to how they should do things. And just because you want to develop somewhere doesn't mean you just go develop. You should go seek the neighbors, get their thoughts on something, see how they react to it before you proceed with anything. Because if you don't, it's going to be negative every single time. But if you want to be in a neighborhood, you should give back to the neighborhood, because people have lived in neighborhoods especially this neighborhood, for so many years. And the last thing you want to do is have the thought that somebody's trying to take over your neighborhood. As I mentioned before, I love this neighborhood. I grew up here. Good, bad, or indifferent. You know, this is where I cut my teeth on being a man. This is where I played. This is a neighborhood that I will die trying to make sure that the history of Elm Thicket Northpark is never forgotten.